Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong? Like no matter how hard you worked, how much you achieved, there would always be someone ready to question your place? Camille Harrington knows exactly what that feels like, but not in the way you'd expect. Picture this: a luxury hotel, 5 stars, a breathtaking poolside view, guests laughing, drinks in hand, the perfect scene of exclusivity. And then, a woman walks in, a woman who, by every unspoken rule of the world, wasn't supposed to fit the image of who belongs in a place like this. At least, that's what one security guard thought. But what he didn't know? She wasn't just another guest. She was the owner of the entire resort. And that's where everything changed. Because this isn't just a story about mistaken identity. It's a story about power, about bias, about the quiet ways people decide who fits and who doesn't. And today, that decision came at a cost. Stay with me, because what happens next, it's a lesson in justice, redemption, and consequences. The sun hung high over Bayfield, a picturesque coastal city where the waves crashed gently against the shore and the scent of salt water mixed with the sweet aroma of blooming hibiscus. The Emerald Bay Resort, a 5-star paradise of marble columns, infinity pools, and handcrafted luxury, stood proudly along the coastline, its glass balconies gleaming under the afternoon light. It was the kind of place where the elite came to escape, where well-dressed guests lounged by the pool, sipping cocktails under striped umbrellas, their laughter blending with the soft tunes of a live saxophonist playing near the cabana bar. Among them, Camille Harrington stepped onto the pool deck, the warmth of the sun pressing against her smooth brown skin. She was 38 years old, poised and striking, with deep brown eyes that had seen both struggle and triumph. Her high cheekbones and full lips carried an effortless grace, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. Today she wore a flowing white sundress, its fabric light against the breeze, draped over a sleek black swimsuit that hugged her toned figure. Her natural curls, normally wild and free, were pulled back into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, revealing a pair of delicate gold earrings that caught the sunlight with every step she took. It had been a long month. Meetings, negotiations, flights from one city to the next. Owning a luxury hotel empire wasn't just about wealth, it was about work. And today, she had finally carved out a moment for herself. No boardroom, no calls, no endless emails. Just a book, a pool, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had built this world with her own hands. She sighed as she reached the edge of the pool area, her sandals making a soft tapping sound against the deck. The cool blue water shimmered, inviting. She glanced around, searching for an empty lounge chair. That's when she felt it, a shift in the air, a presence. She didn't have to turn her head to know someone was watching her. She had felt that gaze before, the kind that weighed heavy, that examined first and assumed later. She took another step forward, but before she could lower herself onto a chair, a shadow loomed over her. "Ma'am!" A voice cut through the afternoon warmth, firm and unwavering. She turned her head slowly, meeting the cold, assessing stare of a stocky man in his early 40s. His navy uniform bore the Emerald Bay Resort security emblem on his chest. His name tag read Ethan Brooks. He had short, dark blonde hair, a face marked by years of authority, and a posture that spoke of someone who believed he had the right to stand in people's way. "This pool is for hotel guests only," he stated, his eyes scanning her like she was an unsolved mystery. Camille blinked once, registering the immediate hostility in his tone. She wasn't the only one walking around the pool deck. There were others, women in wide-brimmed hats, men in linen shirts, some stepping barefoot across the wood. No one else was being stopped. She let out a slow breath, her expression unreadable. She knew this game. "I'm aware," she said evenly, meeting his gaze. Ethan didn't budge. His stance was firm, his hands clasped in front of him like a gatekeeper deciding who was worthy of entry. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. Camille tilted her head slightly, studying him now, the way he squared his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. He didn't know who she was, or maybe he didn't care. Her fingers brushed the thin gold bracelet on her wrist as she took a deliberate step forward. "And why is that?" Ethan's mouth pressed into a line, as if she was wasting his time. "This area is restricted to paying guests," he repeated slower this time, as though speaking to a child. A chill of anger coursed through Camille's veins, but she kept her voice controlled. "And what makes you think I'm not a guest?" The question hung in the air between them, but Ethan barely hesitated before responding. "I just need to see your room key," he said, shifting his weight slightly. Camille's lips parted, a quiet scoff escaping before she could stop it. Room key. Not a simple "may I assist you" or "are you staying with us?" Just an outright demand for proof, one she hadn't seen asked of anyone else in this poolside paradise. She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "And if I don't have it on me?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Then you'll have to leave." The casual arrogance in his tone made something in Camille's chest tighten. The assumption, the authority, the unquestioned belief that he was right and she was wrong. A few guests had begun to watch now, their curiosity like a slow-building wave. Some whispered. Others sipped their drinks and pretended not to notice, choosing the comfort of silence over confrontation. Camille could have ended this right there. She could have told him exactly who she was, wiped that certainty right off his face. But she didn't. Because this wasn't just about her. How many others had walked into this hotel, the one she built, the one she curated with precision and care, only to be met with the same scrutiny? How many guests had been made to feel like intruders in a place meant to welcome them? Her pulse thrummed against her wrist as she held Ethan's gaze. "I think I'll stay right here," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of steel. Ethan's jaw clenched. His patience was waning. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you one last time." The words barely left his mouth before his hand moved toward her arm. A hush fell over the pool area as Camille took a sharp step back, her body stiffening. Too far. "Don't touch me," she warned, her voice dropping into something deadly quiet. Ethan hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He signaled to another security guard standing by the entrance. A younger man, hesitant, unsure, but loyal to the badge he wore. And just like that, the decision was made. 2 guards, 1 woman. They wouldn't listen. They wouldn't step back. So under the golden sunlight, surrounded by luxury and wealth, Camille Harrington, the owner of Emerald Bay Resort, was forcibly escorted from her own poolside, and not a single guest stopped them. The air inside the Emerald Bay Resort lobby was cool, a stark contrast to the blazing heat outside. The scent of freshly polished marble mixed with the floral arrangement near the concierge desk, and the faint sound of a classical piano track played over the speakers. Guests moved about, some checking in, others lounging in the plush velvet chairs. It was a world of quiet luxury, where money softened every step and exclusivity was the currency. But for Camille Harrington, the illusion had just been shattered. The firm grip of Ethan Brooks, the security guard who had confronted her by the pool, remained fresh in her memory. The way his fingers had brushed against her arm, the way he had signaled his partner like she was some problem to be removed. And now here she was, walking through the grand lobby as though she had been caught trespassing. Her heels clicked against the pristine marble floors, each step steady, deliberate. Not a single part of her showed weakness, but inside something simmered. Not humiliation, not fear, just pure, controlled fury. Behind her, Ethan walked stiffly, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The younger security guard, Mark, followed a few steps behind, his nervous glances betraying his uncertainty about what had just happened. He wasn't as sure as Ethan. He hadn't spoken much, but he hadn't stopped it either. The silence stretched between them until Camille finally spoke. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice calm, yet laced with an unmistakable edge. Ethan exhaled through his nose, his jaw clenched. "If there's been a misunderstanding, we can clear it up at the front desk." Camille almost laughed. A misunderstanding? That was always the excuse, wasn't it? An innocent mistake, a simple misjudgment. "You didn't stop anyone else at that pool," she said, keeping her eyes forward as they approached the reception desk. "So tell me, what was it about me that made you so certain I didn't belong?" Ethan's steps faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Ma'am, we have protocols," he said stiffly. "We ensure that only registered guests use the facilities. It's about security, not personal assumptions." Camille finally turned to him, her gaze sharp. "Then tell me, Ethan, how many other guests did you ask for a room key today?" Silence. Ethan looked straight ahead, his jaw tightening just slightly. That was all the answer she needed. As they neared the reception desk, Sophia, the young receptionist, glanced up from her computer. Her warm brown eyes flicked from Camille to the two security guards behind her. Her expression shifted instantly from professional neutrality to something resembling panic. "Miss Harrington!" she gasped, her hands instinctively moving toward the desk, as if she could physically hold the situation together. What's going on?" Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. Camille turned slightly, watching as the weight of realization hit him like a slow-moving wrecking ball. "Miss Harrington?" he repeated, his voice suddenly devoid of the authority it had carried just moments ago. Sophia swallowed hard, her gaze darting between them. She's the owner of Emerald Bay Resort." A heavy silence slammed into the space between them. Ethan's shoulders, once squared with confidence, sagged slightly. His expression, once filled with rigid certainty, fractured with disbelief. Camille didn't move. She let it sink in. Let him drown in the weight of his own assumption. The younger guard, Mark, shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Ethan like he wasn't sure what to do. He had followed orders, but now he realized they had escorted their own boss through her own hotel like an intruder. Ethan started, but the words caught in his throat. Camille raised an eyebrow, waiting. And for the first time since this entire charade had begun, Ethan Brooks looked like a man completely and utterly lost. A heavy silence filled the grand lobby of the Emerald Bay Resort. The kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it carried weight, a thick, suffocating presence that pressed down on everyone standing near the front desk. Guests moving through the space slowed their steps, sensing the shift in the air, the crackle of something unspoken but undeniable. Camille Harrington stood tall, her presence commanding despite the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. The luxurious setting of polished marble, golden chandeliers, and velvet furnishings felt irrelevant now. Across from her, Ethan Brooks, the very security guard who had ordered her removal from the pool, looked as though he'd just been hit by a truck. His usually squared shoulders had slumped ever so slightly, his fingers twitching at his sides, betraying the nerves rattling through him. His blue uniform, once a badge of authority, now felt like a target, marking him as the man who had just humiliated the owner of this very resort. Camille let the silence stretch. She wasn't going to help him out of this. Let him sit in it. Let him feel it. Sophia, the receptionist, stood frozen behind the desk, eyes darting between Camille and Ethan, her face pale as realization crashed over her. She was young, ambitious, and had always admired Camille from afar. Now, she had a front-row seat to a lesson in power, prejudice, and misplaced certainty. Ethan swallowed hard. "Miss Harrington, save it." The words sliced through the tension like a blade. Camille's voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. It carried the force of someone who had fought too hard and too long to entertain excuses. A few guests nearby had paused their conversations, their drinks halfway to their lips, their eyes flickering between the unfolding scene and each other. Some looked intrigued. Scandal was an irresistible force in places like this. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if hoping their own silence wouldn't make them complicit in what had just happened. Ethan's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find footing on ground that was now crumbling beneath him. He had removed Camille from her own poolside, escorted her like an unwanted outsider, and he had done it with confidence, with authority, because in his mind, it had been the right thing to do, because she hadn't looked like she belonged. Camille took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them just enough to make him flinch, but not enough to ease the discomfort he now felt crawling under his skin. "You didn't ask anyone else for a room key," she said, her voice steady, piercing. "You didn't question the other guests." Ethan's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. You saw me," she continued, "and you assumed I didn't belong." More eyes were on them now. Conversations had completely died down. The weight of watching, witnessing, filled the space between them. Camille glanced around, taking in the scene, the gilded decor, the pristine uniforms of the hotel staff, the crystal-clear windows showcasing a view of the ocean she owned. "Tell me something, Ethan." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "If I had been a man in a navy blazer, wearing a Rolex and loafers, would you have asked him for his room key?" Ethan stiffened. The question hung in the air, begging for an answer he couldn't give, because they both knew it. The guests knew it. The staff knew it. The truth was ugly, but it was there, laid bare in front of everyone. The younger security guard, Mark, shifted uneasily beside Ethan. He looked deeply uncomfortable now, his hands clasped together as if he were praying for this to end. Maybe because he recognized it too. Maybe because, even if he hadn't spoken up when it mattered, he knew exactly what had happened here. Camille's gaze flickered to him for half a second, her expression softening slightly, but only slightly. He was younger, new, still figuring out his place in the world. Maybe he'd learn something from this. Maybe he'd do better next time. But Ethan had no excuse. He had been in his position for years. He had power, authority, experience, and yet he had made a snap judgment that led him straight into this moment. The moment where his certainty turned to shame. The moment where the world stopped pretending these things didn't happen. Camille finally let out a breath, slow and deliberate. She could humiliate him further, could call for every guest's attention, could make a spectacle out of his mistake, could tear him apart in the same way he had tried to reduce her to an outsider in a place where she was the foundation. But she didn't. Because humiliation wasn't the goal. Accountability was. So instead, she turned her head toward Sophia, who still stood frozen behind the desk, her hands gripping the edges as though she were trying to hold the entire building steady. "Call a staff meeting," Camille said, her voice calm but laced with finality. "Now." Sophia's eyes widened, but she nodded quickly, scrambling to grab the phone. Ethan exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling as though he were bracing for what was coming next. He knew now. He knew this wasn't something that would just pass. Camille gave him one last look, not of anger, not of hatred, just disappointment, and somehow that was worse. The weight of the moment lingered, thick and suffocating. The hush that had fallen over the Emerald Bay Resort lobby wasn't just silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Camille Harrington stood at the center of it all, her posture unwavering, her expression unreadable. But inside there was a fire, controlled, precise, and burning, with the kind of fury that didn't scream, but seared. Ethan Brooks, the security guard who had ordered her removal from the pool, stood rigid beside her, his breath uneven. He wasn't in charge anymore. He knew it. She knew it. Everyone knew it. The once authoritative stance that had dictated his every move was now just a brittle facade, one crack away from shattering completely. Sophia, the receptionist, was on the phone, her voice low, hurried, calling the necessary staff members to the emergency meeting Camille had just ordered. The message would spread fast. They would all come. Because when the owner of the resort, a woman who had built this place with her own hands, demanded their presence, there were no other options. Camille could feel the eyes of the guests on her. Some were pretending to check their phones, some whispering behind manicured fingers, others simply watching because drama, no matter how unjust, was a spectacle people found hard to ignore. She had seen this before. Not here. But in boardrooms, in negotiations, at dinner parties filled with men who smiled too wide while underestimating her at every turn. It was always the same script. But today she wasn't going to be the one forced to swallow her pride. Her fingers flexed at her sides before she turned, slowly, deliberately, toward Ethan. "You really thought you were right, didn't you?" The question wasn't loud, but it cut deep. Ethan's jaw tensed. He didn't answer. She took a step closer. Not to intimidate him, but to make sure he heard every single word. "You saw me and assumed I didn't belong." Her voice was steady, no anger, just cold, calculated truth. "You put your hands on me." Ethan flinched, just slightly. "You had me escorted out of my own hotel," she continued. "Not because I was causing trouble, not because I was breaking any rules, but because you looked at me and decided I didn't fit the image of who should be allowed at that pool." The way his Adam's apple bobbed told her everything she needed to know. Mark, the younger security guard, shifted uncomfortably beside him. He hadn't said a word since the moment he realized who she was. His hands were clasped behind his back, his lips pressed into a tight line. He looked like he wanted to shrink into the polished floors. Ethan finally exhaled, his voice low, controlled but tinged with something Camille couldn't quite place. "I was just doing my job," he said, though it sounded weak, defensive in a way that even he seemed to realize wasn't enough. Camille let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Doing your job?" She shook her head slowly, her gaze cutting straight through him. "If you were doing your job, you would have asked me if I needed anything. If you were doing your job, you would have treated me like every other guest there." Her voice dropped lower, the steel behind it unmistakable. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Ethan didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. The silence between them was almost unbearable now. The entire lobby felt like it was holding its breath. Finally, Camille exhaled, shaking her head as if shaking off the weight of his mistake. She turned on her heel, her white sundress flowing behind her, and started toward the grand staircase leading to the executive conference room. The security team, the senior managers, the concierge staff, they would all be waiting there. And Ethan? Ethan would have to walk in behind her, knowing that every single step he took was one closer to facing the reality of what he had done. The grand conference room of Emerald Bay Resort was a masterpiece of design. High ceilings adorned with intricate molding, floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the endless ocean, and a gleaming mahogany table long enough to seat the most powerful executives in the hospitality industry. But today, it wasn't a place for board meetings or financial discussions. Today, it was a courtroom. Staff members filed in, their hushed conversations bouncing off the pristine white walls. Managers from different departments took their seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. They had never been summoned like this before. A meeting called by Camille Harrington herself was rare, and if she demanded their presence on such short notice, it meant something big had happened. Ethan Brooks sat stiffly in one of the leather chairs, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew. Mark, the younger security guard, sat beside him, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. Unlike Ethan, he looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. He wasn't innocent, but he had felt the mistake as it happened. He had seen the moment where it all went wrong, but he had chosen silence over action. And now silence wasn't an option. The door opened one last time. Camille Harrington entered. The room stilled. She walked with the kind of effortless grace that came with power that didn't need to announce itself. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way to the head of the table. She didn't slam a folder onto the desk. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, watching, measuring, letting the weight of her presence settle over the room like a storm rolling in over the horizon. And then she spoke. "Does anyone here know what it feels like to be escorted out of your own hotel?" The question landed like a thunderclap. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to answer. Camille exhaled softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the sleek conference table. "Because I do," she continued. "About an hour ago, I was removed from my own poolside. Not because I was causing a scene, not because I was doing anything inappropriate, but because a security guard, one of our own, decided that I didn't belong there." Her eyes flickered toward Ethan. He tensed. The room was dead silent now. Camille straightened, her expression unreadable. "I built this place," she said, her voice controlled but thick with emotion. "I handpicked every detail, the architecture, the fabrics, the scent in the hallways. I built this with the vision of creating a space where anyone could come and feel welcome, where the only thing that mattered was whether you wanted to be here. Not where you came from, not what you looked like, not what someone assumed about you before you even opened your mouth." She let the words settle before continuing. "But today, I was reminded that exclusion isn't just about policies. It's about people. It's about the choices we make, the way we look at someone and decide, without a single word, that they are out of place." Her gaze locked onto Ethan. "Tell me, Ethan," she said, her voice even, but laced with something undeniably sharp. "When you saw me at the pool, what did you see?" Ethan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. Take your time," Camille said, folding her arms. The room waited, and Ethan had never felt more exposed in his life. His entire career had been built on authority, on control. He had never questioned his instincts before. He had never been made to hold a mirror up to himself and examine the flaws in his thinking. Until now. Until her. His lips parted again, but this time his voice wasn't firm. It wasn't confident. It wasn't the voice of a man who knew where he stood. It was a mistake, he said finally, his tone strained, almost forced. Camille lifted an eyebrow. A mistake? Ethan nodded stiffly, trying to cling to any ounce of professionalism he had left. I misjudged the situation. I thought I was just trying to do my job. A sharp breath came from someone in the room. It was Mark. Camille noticed. The younger security guard had his head slightly bowed, his fingers gripping his knees. He looked like someone holding back a truth that burned to be spoken. Mark, she said, turning her attention to him. You were there. Tell me, was it just a mistake? Ethan turned his head sharply toward his colleague, a silent warning in his eyes. But Mark wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at Camille, and he saw her not as a figure of authority, but as a person. His mouth felt dry, but he forced himself to speak. No, he said. His voice was quiet, but in the heavy silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. Ethan stiffened beside him. Mark kept going. It wasn't just a mistake, he admitted, his voice growing stronger. It was an assumption. We assumed, and I didn't stop it. His hands clenched into fists. I should have stopped it. The admission shook something loose in the room. Ethan's entire body tensed, his jaw tightening. But what could he say now? His own teammate had spoken the truth he had refused to admit. Camille nodded slowly, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The room sat in a silence so deep it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The ocean view behind Camille stretched endlessly, its blue waters calm, a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She stood at the head of the conference table, her presence alone a force more powerful than any raised voice could ever be. The weight of what had happened sat heavy in the air, pressing down on everyone present, but no one felt it more than Ethan Brooks. He had been many things in his life, confident, authoritative, sure of his decisions, but never before had he felt this, exposed, stripped bare in front of his peers, facing the undeniable consequences of his actions. He sat stiffly, his eyes locked onto the polished surface of the mahogany table, refusing to meet Camille's gaze. Beside him, Mark, the younger security guard, looked almost nauseous, his hands resting in tight fists on his lap. His admission still hung in the air, fresh and undeniable. It wasn't just a mistake, it was an assumption. Camille let her gaze sweep across the room, not just at Ethan, not just at Mark, but at every single person sitting there. The managers, the concierge team, the senior staff, all of them were part of this. Whether they had spoken up or stayed silent, whether they had watched or ignored it, they were part of a system that had allowed this to happen. And she was going to make sure that ended today. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips against the cool surface of the table. Let me be very clear, she began, her voice steady, each word deliberate. I am not angry because I was asked to leave my own pool. A few heads lifted slightly, surprised. Ethan hesitated, daring to glance up, but Camille's eyes weren't on him yet. I am not angry because I was humiliated in front of guests. I am not angry because I had to walk through my own lobby, escorted like a trespasser. She let that linger, let them believe for a fleeting second that maybe, just maybe, this was something she would let slide. Then she lifted her chin, her expression unreadable. I am angry, she continued, voice now laced something sharp and dangerous, because this isn't just about me. Ethan exhaled, barely audible, like he had braced himself for something worse and was only now realizing this was worse. This is about every single person who has walked into this hotel and been made to feel like they didn't belong. She straightened, folding her arms, her gaze now locked onto Ethan with precision. Tell me something, she said, her voice softer now, but no less deadly. How many others have you done this to? Ethan stiffened, his fingers curling against his thighs. How many? She pressed. And don't you dare tell me none. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He didn't answer. Because there was no answer that would save him now. Mark shifted beside him, his shoulders sinking. He had never questioned Ethan's choices before. He had never thought to. But now, he was seeing them for what they were. Camille let the silence stretch before she continued. This isn't about a policy, she said. This isn't about protocol. This is about bias. It's about the way you see people before they even open their mouths. You think I don't know how this works? She took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the floor. I've spent my entire life walking into places where people have looked at me and thought. She let out a soft, humorless laugh. She must be lost. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving Ethan. But I wasn't lost, was I? She asked, her voice dropping into something almost dangerously calm. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And you were the one who got it wrong. Ethan swallowed hard. I built this place. Camille continued. I built it for everyone. And yet, in my absence, this resort has become something I never wanted it to be. A place where people are judged before they are even spoken to. Her voice was firm, controlled, but laced with disappointment, so sharp it cut deeper than any raised tone ever could. And that, she said, stepping back, is unacceptable. The finality in her voice sent a ripple through the room. This wasn't just a warning. This was a reckoning. Camille turned toward the other staff members, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had stayed silent, who had watched from the sidelines, who had chosen comfort over confrontation. You are all responsible for the culture of this hotel, she told them. You set the tone. You create the experience. And today, that experience failed. Not just me, but every guest who has ever felt out of place in a space meant to welcome them. She let her words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Then she took a breath, her posture remaining firm. Starting now, that changes. Ethan finally looked up at her, and in his eyes, for the first time, there was no defiance, no defensiveness, just the weight of his own actions. The air inside the conference room was thick, not with heat, but with the weight of realization. A room full of professionals, some of the best in the hospitality industry, now sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting, watching, knowing that whatever came next would not be easy to swallow. Camille Harrington stood at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. She wasn't furious. No, fury was too simple. What sat in her chest now was something deeper, something colder and sharper, disappointment. And disappointment, when wielded by a woman who built an empire, was far more devastating than rage. Across from her, Ethan Brooks sat, his posture stiff, his gaze no longer defiant but cautious. He had spent his entire career being certain of his judgment, certain of his instincts, certain that he knew how to read a situation. But today, his certainty had betrayed him. He wasn't the only one. The entire security team sat in uneasy silence. Managers from guest services, concierge, and even housekeeping were present. This wasn't just a lesson for Ethan. This was a wake-up call for all of them. Camille let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable before she finally spoke. Do you know why I called this meeting? A few exchanged glances. Some shifted in their seats. No one dared to answer. Camille exhaled, tilting her head slightly. Oh, don't be shy now. Just a few hours ago, some of you had plenty to say. Ethan swallowed. Camille's gaze swept the room, her presence steady, unwavering. I want to talk about bias. That word, sharp and direct, sent a ripple through the group. You see, there's an ugly little lie that people like to tell themselves, she continued, crossing her arms. It's the lie that bias is something loud, something obvious, that it always comes dressed in slurs or raised voices or obvious malice. She shook her head slowly, her voice measured. But that's not how it works, is it? A few people shifted in their seats again. Bias is quiet, she said. It's the way you look at someone and make a decision before they've even spoken. It's the way you watch some guests more closely than others. It's the way you assume that certain people must have gotten lucky rather than worked hard. Her eyes locked onto Ethan, but she wasn't speaking only to him. It's in the way a woman like me can own a place like this and still be asked to prove she belongs. Silence. No one dared to speak. Camille let her words settle before she leaned slightly forward, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. And let's be clear, this isn't just about me. How many guests have felt this same thing? How many people have walked through these doors and been met with that same suspicion? Her gaze flicked to the head of guest relations. The woman, a polished brunette in her 40s, paled slightly under Camille's stare. You've had complaints, haven't you? Camille asked, tilting her head. The woman hesitated. There have been a few, but nothing. Nothing that made you stop and question why, Camille interrupted. The woman closed her mouth. Exactly. Camille turned her attention back to the room. This resort was built on the promise of hospitality, she continued. And hospitality is more than fresh towels and good service. It's about how we make people feel. And today, I learned that my own hotel made me feel like an outsider. So I have to wonder, how many others have felt the same? Her voice softened just slightly. And how many of you have ignored it? The question landed with a heaviness that settled deep into everyone's bones. Ethan exhaled sharply, his shoulders sinking ever so slightly. Camille watched him for a long moment before she spoke again. "I'm not asking for apologies," she said. "I don't need excuses, and I don't want meaningless reassurances that this won't happen again." She leaned forward. "I want change." Ethan blinked. Camille continued. "From this moment forward, every single employee in this hotel will undergo mandatory training on bias and discrimination. Security, concierge, waitstaff, everyone." Someone from HR shifted. "Miss Harrington, I'm not sure we have the resources for." "We do now," she said, cutting them off. "And it won't be a 2-hour seminar that everyone forgets the next day. It will be ongoing, it will be uncomfortable, and it will be necessary." A few heads nodded, some reluctantly, some with realization dawning on their faces. Ethan, however, looked like a man trying to grasp onto the last remnants of his pride. Camille saw it, and she let him sit in it, because growth wasn't comfortable. "You're a good employee, Ethan," she said finally. "I wouldn't have hired you if you weren't." His eyes snapped to hers. "But being good at your job doesn't mean you can't be wrong," she continued. "It doesn't mean you don't have blind spots, and today you saw one of yours." Ethan's jaw tightened. Camille studied him. "So tell me, Ethan, what are you going to do about it?" The room waited. Ethan inhaled slowly. He had two options. He could fight it, cling to his defenses, make excuses, brush it off. Or he could listen. For the first time in his career, he could admit that maybe, just maybe, he had something to learn. A long moment passed. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll do the training, all of it." Camille's expression didn't change. "Good," she said, "because if you don't, Ethan, you won't be working here anymore." And just like that, the lesson was over. The weight of Camille Harrington's words still lingered in the air long after the meeting had officially ended. No one rushed to leave. The quiet that settled over the conference room was thick. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that forced reflection, the kind that made people sit with themselves in a way they weren't used to. Ethan Brooks hadn't moved from his seat. His hands were clasped together, knuckles white, his mind racing. He had spent years thinking of himself as a man who did things by the book, a man who enforced rules fairly. But today that image of himself had shattered, and the worst part, he couldn't even argue, because he knew Camille was right. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern he had never questioned, because for him, it had never had consequences, until now. Camille stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms crossed as she looked out over the resort she had built. From up here, she could see the pool glistening under the afternoon sun, the very spot where she had been told she didn't belong. She inhaled deeply, then turned back to the table. The senior staff still sat there, watching her carefully, as if waiting for their final verdict. She didn't make them wait. "Here's how this is going to go," she said, her voice even, unwavering. "Ethan, you will be removed from any position of authority within security, effective immediately." Ethan exhaled sharply. He had expected some sort of consequence, but this? "You'll still have a job," Camille continued, "but you won't be making decisions on your own anymore, not until I'm convinced that you understand the depth of what happened today." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "You'll also undergo extensive training, not just on bias, but on hospitality," Camille went on. "I want you to understand what it actually means to create a welcoming space for everyone, not just the people you assume should be here." Ethan felt something bitter rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He had a choice: fight it, resist it, pretend he wasn't wrong, or own it. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice rough but certain. Camille nodded once, then turned to Mark, the younger security guard who had stood beside Ethan the whole time, silent until it was too late. "And you," she said. Mark straightened, his face pale. "You're not being let off the hook either," she told him. "You stood there, you watched, and you didn't say a damn thing." Mark swallowed hard. "I know," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I should have said something. I should have." "Yes," Camille interrupted. "You should have." He flinched. "You're young," she continued, and I'm going to give you a chance to learn from this. But understand this, Mark's silence is complicity. And if I ever catch you standing by again when something isn't right, you won't get another warning. You'll just be out. Mark nodded quickly, his face red, shame sitting heavy on his shoulders. Camille turned her gaze to the rest of the staff. And for the rest of you, she said, her voice carrying across the room, if you think this is just about security, you're wrong. This is about the entire culture of this hotel. Every single one of you plays a role in making sure no guest, no person ever feels like I did today. Some of them nodded, others looked away, but no one could ignore the truth of what she was saying. Camille exhaled, then picked up a sleek black folder from the table, flipping it open. These are the new policies, she said. Training will be mandatory for everyone, and there will be zero tolerance for discrimination, whether it's explicit or hidden under so-called protocols. Her gaze flicked to Ethan one last time. Change isn't optional, she told him. You can either be part of it or get left behind. Ethan didn't argue, because for the first time he saw it. He saw himself, and he didn't like what he saw. The days following the meeting were different, not in a way that could be measured immediately, not in grand gestures or sudden transformations, but in small, almost imperceptible shifts that signaled something deeper taking root. Camille Harrington knew that true change was never instant. It wasn't about a single conversation, a single consequence. It was about choice. The choice to unlearn, to listen, to face the uncomfortable and do something about it. And Ethan Brooks? He had a choice to make. For the first time in years, he wasn't in charge. The weight of authority had been stripped from him, and he felt it in every step he took through the hotel. He wasn't the one making the calls anymore. He was the one taking orders. Observing, learning. At first it burned. It burned when he had to sit through diversity and inclusion workshops alongside new hires, listening to things he had always assumed didn't apply to him. It burned when he was no longer the one deciding who got access to what, when his usual routines were questioned, dissected, reframed. But the hardest part, seeing himself through someone else's eyes. Camille hadn't been cruel. She hadn't raised her voice or humiliated him in front of everyone. She had simply held up a mirror and forced him to look. And what he saw? A man who thought he was fair. A man who thought he knew how the world worked. But fairness wasn't about what he thought. It was about the people who had to live with his choices. For the first time in his life, he had to ask himself a question he had never considered before. How many people had walked away from him feeling less than? How many guests had taken his authority as fact, never daring to challenge it? How many people had accepted his word without fighting back, without Camille's power to stand their ground? The realization sat heavy on his chest, so he listened. Not because he was forced to, but because he finally understood why he needed to. He listened to the hotel staff who had different experiences than him, to the housekeepers, the front desk workers, the waiters, many of whom had their own stories about being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. He listened to Mark, the younger security guard, who had felt the wrongness of that day but had been too afraid to speak. And most importantly, he listened to the guests, not just the ones who looked like they belonged, but the ones who entered cautiously, the ones who checked in with an extra layer of hesitation in their eyes, the ones who were used to being questioned first and welcomed second. One afternoon, as Ethan stood near the pool he had once claimed to protect so fiercely, he saw a woman walk in. She was black, elegant, wearing a flowing yellow sundress, her posture poised but careful, as if she was waiting for someone to challenge her presence. A month ago, he might have approached her. He might have asked for proof before offering a welcome. But today, he smiled. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to Emerald Bay Resort." And for the first time, he meant it. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, its reflection shimmering on the infinity pool of Emerald Bay Resort. The world moved as it always did, guests clinking glasses in quiet celebration, waves rolling against the shore, the warm breeze rustling the palm trees that lined the terrace. But something within the walls of this luxury haven had shifted. Camille Harrington stood near the balcony of her penthouse suite, a glass of water in hand, watching the scene below. She had spent years building this place, not just a hotel, but an experience, a sanctuary, a place where people came to feel valued, to feel at home. And yet, just days ago, she had been reminded that no amount of success, no number of accolades, no title or ownership papers could shield her from the way the world still worked. But she wasn't bitter. No, she was determined. Change didn't come from anger alone. It came from action, from forcing people to see what they had refused to acknowledge before. Her gaze dropped to the pool area, where a familiar figure stood near the entrance. Ethan Brooks. He wasn't in uniform today. Not in the way he used to be. He still worked security, but his role had changed. He wasn't the one making decisions anymore. He was the one following orders, learning, rebuilding. He had fought it at first, of course. Old habits didn't die easily. But over the past few weeks, Camille had watched something interesting happen. He started listening, really listening. Not just to her, but to the guests, the staff, the people he had never really paid attention to before. And now, as he stood at his usual post, his posture was different. Less rigid, less defensive. He wasn't scanning the crowd looking for people who didn't belong. He was looking to welcome. At that moment, a young black couple approached the pool. The woman hesitated just slightly, her hand tightening around the strap of her beach bag. That small pause, Camille recognized it instantly. It was the kind that came from years of being questioned, from experiences that had taught her not to expect acceptance so easily. Ethan noticed too. A month ago, he might have asked them for a room key, might have approached them with that same air of authority he had once worn like armor. But today, he smiled. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice even, welcoming. "Can I help you find anything?" The tension in the woman's shoulders eased. The man beside her nodded. "No, we're good. Just looking for a spot to relax." Ethan gestured toward the open cabanas. "There are some great shaded spots over there, and the bar has fresh fruit smoothies if you're interested." The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if she was waiting for something else. Some unspoken condition, some hint that maybe they weren't as welcome as his words suggested. But it never came. Just a genuine offer. A quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that something was different now. She smiled. "Thanks." Ethan nodded and stepped aside. No second glance, no suspicion, just hospitality. From the balcony, Camille exhaled, a slow, measured breath. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to her, it was proof that the world could change. Not overnight, not without resistance, not without discomfort, but it could. She took one last sip of water, then turned back toward her desk, where a folder full of new policies and upcoming diversity training schedules waited. Because change didn't just happen, it had to be built. And that, my friends, is the power of perception. It's the danger of assumptions, the quiet, unspoken biases that shape our world in ways we don't even realize, until they're exposed. Today, Ethan learned a lesson he'll never forget. But the real question is, what about you? How many times have you judged someone too quickly? How many opportunities have you missed because of the way you saw or didn't see someone? And here's the hardest question of all. If you were in Ethan's shoes, would you have done the same? Change starts with awareness, but it doesn't end there. It's about action. It's about seeing people for who they truly are, not just who we assume them to be. So I challenge you, next time you catch yourself making a snap judgment, pause. Ask yourself, is this fact or just my own bias? Let me know in the comments, have you ever experienced something like this? Or maybe, have you ever realized your own bias and changed because of it? Let's talk about it. And if this story made you think, even just for a second, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we challenge perspectives. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.